Today we're going to be reviewing 3 Makita cordless saws for you. We've had these 3 saws all for about a year. We bought them all in the last year. We've used them on the job site and in the shop for the same amount of time. Different purposes for each saw, we'll talk about that. Different weights and costs for each saw. All of them are good saws. You'd be happy with any of them so long as you bought it for the right reasons. So we'll go through them in order. We'll talk about the features of them, and then we'll do a cut test at the end. And hopefully that will help you figure out any decision making if you're looking at buying one of these, or if you have one and you're learning about its features. First one we have is a XSH06. This is a all metal saw, or all metal body, metal base plate, metal guard, metal tunnel, plastic housing over here, 2 batteries. This is a 36 volt model, so it takes 2 18 volt batteries. I believe it's going to come with a pair of 5 amp hour batteries, but anything over 3 you can run in it, 3, 4s, and 5s. It has a battery indicator on it, so if you pick it up and you want to see where your battery levels are at, you don't have to remove the batteries. You just push this button and it'll tell you we're at full charge on both batteries. It has your standard assist to get rid of that guard if you need it out of your way. It is sort of muted. It doesn't have a tab on it like a lot of other saws do. It took me a minute to get used to that because you can't just grab it kind of automatically. You have to look for it. Your depth is back here, traditional lever. They were kind enough to extend it out where you can actually get to it instead of leaving it way up in here where you got to try to get one finger to it, so you can get it up and down. It does have sort of a rudimentary depth gauge. It's hard to see, but you can sort of get an eyeball on it and line that up without having to get out a tape measure or a block of wood and line it up and then lock it back down. This has a push grip on this side if you're pushing, if you're a 2-handed operator. It has a slot for a guide, which I believe it comes with. If you want a rip gauge to run parallel with the edge of a board, you can run that here. It's not something we use, so has a stow for your, if I can get it out of here, for your Allen wrench. So instead of a traditional blade wrench, this is going to have an internal Allen. It also has an external, so if you keep a wrench with your blade pack or something like that, you can also use that, but this stows right on the saw. The blade lock right here, right out front, where you can actually rest your hand on the push grip or on the tunnel, depending on how you change blades, and lock that blade spindle for blade removal. It also has a spot on the front for an accessory. If you want to mount a hook, which we did when we first bought this, we bought the hook. I think this was, I don't know, 20 bucks or something. It bolts on. We thought it was nifty for a minute, but if you are not using the hook and you stow it, this guy comes up and hits it and you can't cut any further. And we got really annoyed with that. You have to keep it in the out position to use this. So sort of self-defeating. We ended up taking it off. We don't use it anymore. There is no option on this saw for suction. If you wanted to do anything with a shop vac or a dust remover, you're not going to have much option with that. It does have a light down in here. When you activate the trigger, you'll see that it lights your kerf, so you can see the edge of your blade. You know, in dim light situations, you have a little bit of help there. Front has a bevel all the way to 56 degrees, from 0 to 56. And then this is your presets where you can set a detent and have it stop at any of those detents you want. So if you're a trim guy, this is a little bit more towards the trim side of the spectrum, less towards the framing side of the spectrum. Has a few nicer features. Not a light saw, but definitely plenty of power. It runs a full-size blade. Next we have the XSR01. This is again a dual battery saw, runs twin 18 volt batteries, comes with 5s. You can run 3s, 4s, and 5s in it. This saw is magnesium, presumably for the lightness, because this is a monster of a saw. Metal here, metal here, metal here. And then the motor itself, all of this through here is metal, where on the other saw, that's all plastic. The only thing plastic on this saw is the battery housing and the handle. This also has a pushing forward grip. It's a full grip, not a bump grip like that one. It has a rear trigger area, which makes the saw very front heavy. So if you hold the saw out here, it's going to hang down like this, whereas this saw, very neutral handling characteristics. This saw, you really know you got a hold of something because the weight's all out at the front of it, which I think is where this saw gets its handle from, because this is the neutral position on this saw. So if you're carrying it around, you're going to carry it like this probably, because you're not going to want to carry it like this or it's going to be hanging way down. This one comes with the hook, comes built in. It stows down out of the way, completely out of the way. It comes out to a 90-degree position and a 180-degree position. Very useful hook, and it stays out of your way for everything except changing this battery. You got to flip it up to get to that battery. If we look at the front, you've got the same exact kind of bevel sets as you do on this one. You got your detents, you got your clamp, you have your front actuated spindle lock. You do have a dust port here. This will pull dust. We've never used it. It's all plugged up. But if you wanted to use an adapter for a shop vac or something, you could pull dust out of the blade tunnel. It also has a depth gauge on it, much more user-friendly than the other saw because it's right out here where you can see it instead of being buried behind the blade guard. Just flip it up, set your depth, and lock it down. This one does have a gripper, unlike the other one. This is going to be much more consistent if you're an electric skill saw guy user. All of your saws will have this. This one, it's muted, so you don't have anything positive to grab there. This is a metal tab with a big ledge to grab a hold of. The differences between these two saws power-wise is not going to be noticeable unless you're cutting very substantial wood. This saw has more power only because it's a worm drive and it's a right angle, got a worm gear in there. It is going to pull away. If you're cutting a lot of 2x, you'll notice a difference. But cutting 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch plywood, there'll be no comparison between the two of them that's obvious. This saw, one thing we don't like about this saw, when you're cutting, the blade guard retracts as it should normally in 1.5 inch material because of where this hits. If you're cutting 1/2 inch material, this will stop dead. It will not retract. And you have to start the saw in a tilted position to get that blade to retract, get the blade guard to retract, and then you drop it in to your cut in the plywood. It's very annoying, and we haven't found a fix for it. So we typically, if we're cutting sheet goods, we're cheating and we're starting like this, which is not a recommended or especially safe way to do it. If we go over here to the little guy, this is metal in its base plate, metal in its blade tunnel, plastic everywhere else, small motor, single battery, 18 volt, weighs almost nothing, very handy little saw to have. Does not run a full-size blade, runs a 6.5 inch blade, I believe. 6.5 inch blade. The front, it has your bevel, but with no detents or bevel stops. You just have to eyeball it. This one has a track available for running parallel on a edge guide. Your depth adjustment is over here, kind of under the motor. No indicators of depth, so you're going to have to check with a tape measure or with your material and make sure your depth is what you want it before you set that down. This saw is not got a ton of power. It's a good saw, but it's down on power. Your cut times are a lot longer, and we don't use this saw for anything other than quick cuts. It's spent the last couple months on a pile of trim, a big house we're working in, and if we need a 6-foot piece of trim off of a 16-footer, we can just grab this saw and whack it before we take it upstairs to do the final cutting. Or if we got to run to the lumber yard and we know we're getting a 16-foot board, but we need it to be 2/8, we can just grab this right out of the truck and cut the board right in the alley of the lumber yard and then load it up. Very, very simple and easy for those kinds of things. Does not have any kind of battery indicator on it, so you're going to need to go to the battery itself and check for the power levels. But very useful little saw if that's what you need it for. We are going to do a cut test now. We've got a 12-inch LVL, 1 3/4 thick. Just a scrap from a job site. We're going to cut it cross grain. We're going to put a brand new blade on the big saws so that there's no advantage by these blades being sharper than the other. And then this guy has a brand new blade on it last week, so I'm confident that blade's in pretty good shape. So here we go. So to wrap it up, any of these saws you buy is going to be fine. They're going to be reasonable quality, reasonable price point. Batteries all have good run life. If you're used to the Makita platform, you'll be pleased with their performance in that regard. If you are a framer, this is what this saw is for. This is not going to be useful in your basement cutting paneling. This is useful on a pile of 2x4s, up in the trusses, on a subfloor. This is a big heavy saw with a hook, with lots of power. That's what this saw is for. You're not going to find much use for it other than that. This saw would be probably for the overachieving homeowner, the do-it-yourself guy. This would be useful building tree forts, cutting plywood in your basement, doing all those kinds of things. It would do any of those things very well with an extended runtime and a substantial advantage in power over a single battery saw. This saw is probably your very average do-it-yourself saw. It'd be great to have in your garage, great to have in your tool shop in the basement, great to have in the back seat of your truck if you're going to the lumberyard to cut stuff. Not a production saw. If you want the freedom of cordless, but don't need a ton of power and you don't need a ton of runtime, this saw should fill all of those needs for you. But any way you stack it, you're going to get a good saw. Hopefully that helps you figure out what you want to buy and how you're going to use them.